Well, we all have them. Those days where we mark tender anniversaries. And this is one of those days for me. 45 years ago, at 5:25 in the afternoon, I received the news from my dad that my maternal grandmother, Porchy, died. And any of you who have heard me speak before, you know there are a lot of times when I speak about Porchy, she had a dramatic effect on my life. She was such a holy woman. She taught me so many beautiful things in life. And what made her death so memorable was not simply the loss of somebody who was so important in my life, but my grief that day was intensified because it was, while she was ill, it wasn't expected that it would happen. It also was my very first day on the job as parochial vicar at Sacred Heart Church in Shadyside. And while I did have the joy before I reported for my assignment to be the last person whom my grandmother went to confession to, and she was the first person whom I anointed, since that was shortly after I was ordained a priest. What made that day so painful is that I couldn't go home. I couldn't be with my family as they were sharing our loss. The people that I was with, they didn't have any real knowledge of me, let alone of my grandmother. And so there was nobody that I could really turn to in terms of sharing the grief. And so her death, painful as it was more intensified by my inability to be with anybody who could appreciate what I was feeling or my appreciation of what they were feeling. And in addition to the fact that this is the anniversary of her death and these feelings are alive and raw in me, I marvel at the beauty of the consolation that you and I hear today in today's gospel. Jesus speaks about precisely that same kind of heaviness of heart. And he speaks about the heaviness of heart not simply because he saw it in the faces of his apostles who were sitting at the Last Supper table with him. He was feeling it himself. In his own humanity, Jesus was feeling what was now going to be the loss, that he was going to be leaving the apostles. And you and I can only imagine the things that were going on in the minds and the hearts of the apostles as they're becoming aware that very shortly Jesus was not going to be with them physically. And they must have been asking them lots of questions like, what the heck is going on here? Did we waste our times? We left the things that we did, our jobs as fishermen or a job as a tax collector or our former lives, and all of a sudden this is all going to come to an end? We've walked with him over the course of 3 years and now it's all going to come to an end? And Jesus knew what was in their own hearts. But he also kept on telling them something at the Last Supper, which later on became a strong consolation to them after Jesus' resurrection, certainly after his ascension, and certainly with Pentecost. How many times over the course of these last days, when we have been reflecting on the Last Supper discourse in John's Gospel, has Jesus been speaking about the Father and I are one? And I'm going back to the Father, and I have come from the Father. And that certainly gave the apostles the understanding to say that just as Jesus really didn't leave the Father when he came to the earth, he came to fulfill his will, so when he went back to heaven, he didn't leave them behind. He promised that he would in fact be with them. And don't we see that consolation being spoken of to the apostles from Jesus' lips at the Last Supper? And don't we see that active again in the first reading that Locke read for us? Those opening lines, where Paul is in Corinth, and once again, he's going to be facing, if you will, the firing squad. of all this people who are going to be calling into question the fact that he was a traitor, that he was telling lies, that he was trying to get people to pull aside from, the civil authorities to go to believe in this person whose name is Jesus. And we know that likewise, like the grief that the apostles were beginning to feel about the separation from Jesus, Paul was feeling the same thing in the midst of the threats that he was faced with. And Jesus comes to remind him, remember me, trust in me, I am with you at all times. And so I got to tell you, 45 years ago on this day, when I was all alone trying to deal with my own personal loss, what gave me consolation that day is when I was able to go beyond my grief and know that the Lord Jesus was in fact with me then, as he is always. And I dare say that that's the same consolation that any one of you and all of you of faith feel when you have a tender anniversary like this one is for me. In many ways, I think we have all these images of what hell is about. And I think really and truly, as I've thought about it over the course of these years, and I was thinking about it again this morning, hell is really eternal self-confinement. Hell is not being separated from God, obviously, and it's being separated from other people. And thank God that we have a Jesus who comes to save us from hell. He comes to give us the eternal promise that he's always with us. And it's the consolation that we face when we remember our grief. And it is the consolation that we know whenever we feel alone, because we really are not alone. He is always with us. And so today, just as the apostles later on would appreciate the consolation Jesus spoke to them at the Last Supper, today as we remember the consolation that Paul had at Corinth by the presence of Christ, today as we remember the life of Rita of Cassia, all the difficulties that she faced in her life that did not turn her away from God, but brought her closer to God and to help other suffering people, let's remember the same and embrace it. That if we ever feel like we're separated from God, it's not God's fault. That whenever we feel separated from God, we know that Jesus promised to his apostles, to Paul, to so many ancestors of our faith is true for us. He, in fact, is with us. And while he is sitting at the right hand of the Father, following the ascension, he certainly has not left us behind.